agenda for the afternoon. I would like to now invite on stage Mr. Joakim Sorelius, the head of 5G and RAN architecture at Ericsson, and Ms. Gulveen Olak, special correspondent with the Economic Times. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause. And now I believe it is time to welcome a very special guest, the Secretary of the Department of Telecom, Madam Aruna Sundararajan. Kindly, please join us on stage, and a huge round of applause from the audience. Now, before any disruptive technology is actually put into practice, I think we can all agree that a lot of work is required at the ground level, at the grassroots level. So at this time, for sake of shedding light on that particular topic, can I please request Mr. Sorelius to help us understand the game-changing developments when it comes to 5G, where they're occurring, how they're occurring, and how the Indian telecom industry in particular is preparing to embrace this technology. Sir, please.
Thank you very much, Honorable Madam Minister, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. As we know, cellular connectivity has been enormously successful around the world in the last years. Ericsson recently released our latest version of what we call the mobility report, where every 6 months we give a temperature on the telecom market and what is going on. And you can see here the result in the predicted number of mobile subscriptions around the world. Already today, LTE is the dominant mobile telephony technology. There are 7.8 billion cellular subscriptions in the world, and LTE is by far becoming the biggest already now. In India in particular, because of the success of LTE, the data amount is growing tremendously. Today, the average Indian subscriber uses 4 gigabytes of data per month. And we predict that by 2023, this will grow by 11 times in the total in the networks. So huge data growth in India going forward. And of course, this puts enormous demand of the mobile networks, or enormous pressure on the mobile networks that are already deployed and into the future. So we talked a lot about 5G and use cases today. And I believe that the understanding of the 5G use cases is starting to mature in the industry. Because of the traffic explosion, 11 times by 2023, enhanced mobile broadband will, of course, be a very important use case for 5G. In order to cope with the traffic, new frequency bands are needed, and those frequency bands are best being used with new technology. Already today, operators are working on fixed wireless access, especially in the rural areas, trying to use unused spectrum assets they have in order to provide new services. But to truly compete with fiber, you're going to need gigabit speeds on this fixed wireless access, and then 5G networks will become necessary. On the top of this graph, we have 2 new emerging types of use cases. One is the massive MTC, which are all the sensors and measurements that are going around on the world. And the other one, the critical MTC, where ultra-low latency and very high reliability are needed. And these are really the new use cases that 5G is attempting to address. But we don't have to wait for 5G to start addressing these use cases. Massive machine type communication, for example, is already today successfully addressed by LTE through narrowband IoT and Cat-M type of technologies. Even some types of critical MTC applications can also be addressed. But the challenge on these type of use cases don't only rely on technology, they also rely on business models and business cases. It's relatively straightforward for operators today to address the consumer market because it's a very highly scalable business. You distribute many SIM cards to many subscribers. And you can do package plans and so forth, but still it's a very well understood business. However, on the top level of this graph, the massive machine type communication, the critical machine type communication, here's more of a business-to-business type of model, where the revenue streams are less understood and are being worked on. So from Ericsson's perspective, LTE And narrowband IoT and Cat M1 is a perfect starting ground for starting to address these types of use cases. Because then you will learn what the business models looks like, and operators will learn how the revenue streams will flow and become experts. Now, there are and will be challenges to do this. And the question is it worth it for operators to go into these new businesses? Well, it definitely is. We have made a very thorough study together with Arthur D. Little, where we looked at 400 use cases in these type of categories. Those use cases, we have divided them into 3 broad categories. One category where it doesn't matter if you're 4G or 5G. One category where the use case will be addressed better with 5G. And the third category where the use case can only be addressed by 5G technologies because of low latency requirements or reliability requirements or security requirements. And if you take those use cases that are either enhanced or only made possible by 5G, we call them 5G-enabled use cases. And if we look at them and calculate what kind of revenue potential those use cases have for the industry, we come to some very staggering numbers globally. But even for India, it amounts to $27.3 billion of additional revenue on top of mobile broadband and on top of fixed wireless access for Indian companies in 2026. So the potential today, or the revenue today is quite small in these areas, but there is a huge opportunity for the future, and this will grow rapidly. And it's important for all of us to be part of this journey to address these use cases going forward. And we talked about many of them today, so I'm not going to go through them again, but the most important ones are in energy and utilities, where smart grids require very low latencies to steer the energy into different domains, manufacturing, public safety, healthcare, transport, and so on. All these use cases are 5G enabled in the sense that they will be enhanced or made possible by 5G. And even if 5G is not absolutely necessary for all 400 of them, because of the load of the networks today with all the end-user traffic for mobile broadband and the predicted increase by 11 times in India, 5G technology is definitely needed to make sure that you can address these use cases at all in a cost-efficient manner, that there's actually space left in the networks to address them. So how will operators go about in order to be able to start addressing these then from a network perspective? Well, 5G will, in its initial phase, rely on 4G. So 5G networks will be deployed with a tight coordination with 4G. There are many reasons for this. One is, of course, that the higher frequency bands have lower coverage and require 4G in order to get ubiquitous coverage of 5G services. So that's one aspect. What this means is that the 4G networks will have to be enhanced in preparation for 5G. So 5G, from a network perspective, is not a revolution, it's an evolution. You start with investments you're making today. You're enhancing your multi-standard network. You are enhancing your core networks with virtualization. We introduce new architectures. You are preparing your transport network for the higher throughputs and the lower latencies. We talked about all that today. On top of that, you introduce some 5G technologies into your 4G networks. That's what Ericsson called the 5G plugins. And these are massive MIMO, the massive IoT, low latency, new architectures in RAN, like Cloud RAN and virtualization. And then finally, as a final step, when the new 5G frequencies are available, you introduce the actual 5G carrier, the 3GPP NR carrier on top of it. So it's a smooth and evolutionary journey towards 5G. The networks are evolved seamlessly, but the benefits become quite revolutionary in the sense that you can then address not only the growing data traffic in today's network, but the new use cases for the future. So the migration path is quite clear. We start by enhancing our 4G networks. We build 4G and 5G together where it makes sense from a capacity perspective. Then we start to densify the 5G network, make a bigger coverage to reach all areas and be able to cover also industries and other applications and use cases. And finally, in the distant future, 5G will be a standalone system replacing 4G completely, but that is quite far out in time. So as a summary, due to the traffic growth in many networks, the need for 5G is really here now, and we need to start prepare immediately. The use cases and the potential for 5G has been quite well understood by now. And operators understand that you start with mobile broadband, it has a business case by itself, and then you use that enhanced mobile broadband network to serve new revenue streams with a very high business potential. And luckily, the technologies for a smooth evolution are already here and already available today. So this journey can start today by enhancing the 4G network, by enhancing the transports, by building the architecture of the core networks and the radio networks for the future, and then finally introducing 3GPP NR as a last step. Thank you.
Mr. Sorelius, thank you for that informative talk about how 5G has been not just revolutionary, but evolutionary. And now I ask that you please rise to welcome a very special guest to the podium. Please join me in welcoming the Secretary of the Department of Telecom, Madam Aruna Sundararajan, to share her perspective on the topic.
Thank you. Joakim, Gulveen, friends. At the outset, let me congratulate the Economic Times for having organized this 5G Congress at this most opportune moment. I believe ET has, over the years, been picking up very key subjects that are of importance both to our economy and society. And I think the fact that they have picked on 5G is a virtual proclamation that the age of 5G is about to begin. And in fact, if you looked carefully at Joakim's last slide, which I think some of you may have missed, it did say the future 5G is now here. Having said, or made those opening remarks, let me also share with you how the government of India is looking at 5G and what is it that we as a country need to do in order to ensure that we remain not as someone who is trying to catch up on 5G, but as a nation that actually is at the leadership level in 5G when it comes. We may not be at a leadership level in terms of all the technologies, but I certainly do believe that in terms of usage of 5G and in terms of developing the use cases for 5G, I do believe that we have an opportunity to be a leader. Now, first of all, as was again mentioned by Joakim, India is witnessing a huge increase in data consumption. We have seen just in the space of one short year how India has gone from fairly low to mid ranges of data usage per capita to very high levels of mobile per capita data usage. And this has been accelerated by the fact that today all major telecom players are indeed moving towards making all their networks 4G enabled. Within the next few months, we do expect that all major telcos would have upgraded their networks to 4G. And while there will still be parts of the country where the earlier legacy technologies will continue to be used, the rate at which even rural Indians are adapting to the new technology and the kind of appetite that we are seeing in the rural areas for digital and for data is going to accelerate the 4G rollouts and the migration towards newer and newer technologies. India also is emerging as a very vibrant startup ecosystem for IoTs. And we know that IoTs are going to be one of the key drivers for use cases as far as 5G is concerned, along with mobile broadband. So, as these two ecosystems for mobile broadband and for IoTs and M2M communications mature, certainly we expect that there will be unprecedented opportunities for growth in the 5G as well. Earlier in the day, I'm sure you would have heard the Minister for Communication indicate broadly what is the roadmap for India as far as 5G is concerned. The government has already taken a number of steps. We have put in place a high-level consortia, and I want to underline that this consortia and committee represents all the key stakeholders. Apart from the Department of Telecommunications, it also has representation from the Ministry of IT, which will have to play a very key role in the development of standards for IoT, in the development of the devices that will be rolled out, in the regulatory frameworks that will be there and which will be relevant for all the use cases, whether it is IoT in healthcare or IoT in agriculture. The Department of Science and Technology, again, I think you would have heard the Secretary Science and Technology share with you the technology vision for 5G. We have some of the leading academia, not just from India, but across the globe on that consortia. And we have leading telcos as well. Because we need to work as a coalition if 5G is to happen. We need to have the regulatory framework in place. We need to have the device ecosystem, the research ecosystems in place. We need to have the startup ecosystem, which needs to work on the various usage scenarios which have begun to be defined. We need the telcos who are going to actually roll out these technologies and have the new networks. And we need the rest of industry, which is actually going to be using all this to be here. And all these are indeed represented in the government-led consortia that has been constituted. Secondly, I am happy to share with you that the Government of India has approved a 5G test bed that will be anchored by the IIT Chennai. We hope that within the next 6 months, the test bed will become operational. It will have the participation of other IITs as well. And this is going to be a key enabler in ensuring that the kind of devices that we need, the kind of sensors that we need for the 5G ecosystem, as and when the networks become ready, it will ensure that India does indeed have them. The regulatory framework is going to be extremely critical, and therefore, once the consortia and the expert committee actually identify what are the spectral bands which we need for 5G, I'm sure the operators would have already shared with you what their plans for and what they look forward to from the government. We will be working with them to ensure that the necessary regulatory system for 5G will be in place. As I have already mentioned, while India may have been or may have had a significant amount of catching up to do, we have today reached a phase when we can leapfrog. For example, if we look at how many parts of the country have leapfrogged from 2G to 4G, similarly, we expect that given the proactive steps that the government and the industry and the academia are together taking in tandem, we should be in a position where India will not lag behind the rest of the world in terms of 5G. Why is 5G of particular relevance to a country like India? One, because this is a country which is digitizing more rapidly than most. You can look at any sphere of the economy or social interaction, and we know for a fact that India is indeed one of the fastest adopters of new technologies today, whether it's in digital payments, whether it's in social media applications, whether it is in terms of some of the newer applications that are coming in. And therefore, given that India has so much at stake in digitization, and given that we expect India's digital economy to be no less than $1 trillion in a few years from now, it means that all these great technologies that hold so much potential for bringing jobs, increasing GDP, and bringing services to the people in India, whether it is the cloud, whether it is big data, whether it is AI, whether it is robotics, all of these will need 5G if India is to leverage these technologies. Therefore, given the fact that we not only have high stakes in these technologies, but also given that we have two very mature industries, the IT industry and the telecom industry, it is an area of opportunity for India as a whole. And it is in order to harness this opportunity that we need to make sure that we are not behind the curve, but actually right on top. Joakim was outlining here that not only is the need amply demonstrated for 5G, but the two other key drivers that need to be there, namely the use cases as well as the availability of technologies, they have already been demonstrated here in India. We saw this in the India Mobile Congress. Many of you would have seen both the telcos as well as some of the leading technology players have outlined how they're already positioning themselves in this technology. And I think that is what gives us the necessary confidence and optimism to believe that India is indeed getting ready for this new technology. I only want to share here that we are working on the new telecom policy. One of the key pillars of the new telecom policy will be what are the steps needed for India to take advantage of 5G. So whether it is in terms of ease of doing business, whether it is in terms of reservation of spectrum and allocation of spectrum, whether it is in terms of Make in India so that the necessary devices for 5G can be locally available, whether it is the standards which need to be developed. Again, in standards, as you know, India has been actively participating in the 3GPP. And in fact, one of the contributions made by India has already come into the standards of the 5G. And India will continue to work actively in the various standards bodies in this area. So let me just conclude my remarks by saying that today's Congress is an important step as we evolve our roadmap. It's an important occasion because the outcomes from this conference will be feeding into the NTP and into the roadmap that we will be sharing with you in a couple of months from now. It is also important because most of you who are going to be the critical stakeholders in the rollout of 5G, whether you represent the telco industry or standards bodies or OEMs, all of you are going to be the key people who are going to adopt and make possible the 5G rollout sooner rather than later. So I think your experiences, your insights, your suggestions, which will be shared by ET with us and with the other stakeholders, I think will be very important. So once again, let me congratulate ET for organizing this at a very timely moment, and let me end by affirming that with this coalition in place, this partnership between the government, the academia, the industry, and the startups, we do believe that the roadmap for 5G commences right here and right now.
Thank you, ma'am, for those very inspiring words, and especially so for highlighting all of the critical ingredients for us to form that 5G ecosystem. Now, it's not every day that we have such up close and personal access to representation from both the public sector and industry. So I'd like to now call upon Gulreen to lead us through a conversation that focuses on the viability of 5G technology.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Both of you have laid down what is required for 5G and where is India in 5G. Ma'am, I'd like to start with you. You've said that, of course, India will be at par. But compared to developed markets where 5G is being talked about already and some services also being rolled out, do you think that India will be at par with those developed markets compared to at par with those developed markets at the moment?
See, as I was mentioning in my remarks, the rate at which India adopts 5G will depend on 2 or 3 key factors, right? One, do we have the enabling environment, regulatory environment, to incentivize the big telcos and the telco networks to roll out the necessary 5G networks? And I think that is something that we absolutely will be addressing in the policy, because we do want to make sure that India does not miss the 5G boat this time. The second thing is that the consumption patterns that are emerging in India, the kind of data usage that is happening in India, and the kind of use cases that were mentioned here, how soon will these industries be ready to actually use 5G? I think that is going to be a second critical factor. And I think a third critical factor will also be the kind of startups that we see in this space. Because unless we have more and more use cases, because in this case, I think, demand for data is there, but whether the demand will translate into demand for 5G, an effective demand for 5G, that will happen only when services that people need, whether it is, healthcare, whether it is education, whether it is better agriculture, whether it is faster transport, more smart cities, I think these are the things that are going to drive 5G. And what we are trying to do from the government side is to ensure that all the actors are in alignment to take advantage of this opportunity, because it is an unprecedented opportunity for India.
Ma'am, you mentioned about the test bed that is being created in IIT. Could you give us a few elements of, are there any use cases being tested out there? And what is the bedrock of a formation of this test bed?
See, the test bed will basically work on 2 or 3 things. One is it will work on the devices which will be 5G ready or that need to be 5G ready. The second thing is sensors, because machine-to-machine communication is going to be such an important element. And India is expected to be a big market for machine-to-machine communication. Because as I said, a lot of services which in traditionally developed markets are expected to be digitally available in India. We don't have the kind of conventional infrastructure that we ought to have in some of these sectors. But we expect that the digital platforms will actually make available these services. So for that, M2M is going to be key. Digital healthcare being one key example. And the third area in which the test bed will work will be on ensuring what kinds of spectrum bands will be used for 5G and giving us in the government the appropriate recommendations for that.
Okay, I want to get a sense of what is the roadmap of spectrum and devices globally, and where does India stand at the moment in that? What is the future outlook do you see for the Indian market in those 2 aspects?
Yes, I'd like to answer that. First, I would like to say that I'm extremely encouraged by what I've seen and heard here today about the focus that exists in India on bringing the infrastructure and the spectrum regulations and so on for 5G into place. Because, I mean, we talk sometimes about developed market and less developed market, but India is one of the markets where the data consumption is the highest in the world, and it has accelerated tremendously just over the past couple of years. So I think there's for India, a fantastic opportunity to benefit from the type of technologies that 5G brings in that environment across the continent with a huge scale of the population and all the things. If we can get one unified regulation, I think that will be extremely successful. And that's actually an advantage for India of having that scale and can actually grow very, very fast into 5G. Also, the timelines that we've been discussed here today are very much in line with the global timelines. So we see that the standards are being completed now as we speak. The final 3GPP meeting is now in December. Then, of course, there will be some correction phases and so on. But our estimate, and working with device partners, we see that the first 3GPP compliant chipsets will be in our labs in, say, the first half of next year, leading to devices in early 2019, first smartphone or end consumer devices. They will, of course, not be optimized for cost or for global market. They will be used for early adopters, I would say. But then very quickly afterwards, 6 months afterwards, so in early 2020, that's when we're going to see the really optimized 5G devices that can be used globally. So, and most geographies, the spectrum situation in most geographies are matching this type of timeline. So early spectrum in limited scale available in 2019, but then globally and nationally in 2020.
Ma'am just mentioned about the fact that spectrum bands are being considered. According to you, what spectrum bands should be considered? As you said, there has to be some kind of harmony between global and as well as Indian standards. As far as spectrum bands are concerned, where do you think, or which ones do you think are apt?
So coming from the telecom vendor community, we of course advocate that all available bands should be made available for cellular connectivity as much as possible. But if we should focus on some bands for 5G in the early days, we see, let's say, two main bands coming online early. The first one is the mid bands or the L bands, or the 3.5 gigahertz, around there, between 3.5 and 4.9 maybe, around there. Then we see also the millimeter wave on 28 and 39 gigahertz. But of course, if you're looking for coverage, it's the lower bands that are the most important ones in the beginning. So it would be the mid-band region that we are also discussing here today.
Ma'am, you've mentioned about how telecom operators need to get on board, and they are the ones who will be driving this. At the same time, the industry is faced with a situation where financial investments are hard to make given the stress in the market. So huge investments are needed out for rolling out 5G. Do you think the industry has the health to fund these at the moment?
See, in the first place, what we are seeing is, and you would have heard this from the telco operators themselves, that in this business, if you have to survive and sustain, then you cannot afford to lag behind in technology. That is probably the one most important lesson that the recent past has also taught us. So I am given to understand from various statements that I see that people are indeed upgrading their networks and moving on to the newer technologies. We also heard and we saw demonstrations in the India Mobile Congress where many of the leading operators have already told you what their 5G plans are. You know, in fact, many of them had actually showcased what they're doing in MIMO, etc. So I think there is no reason to be other than optimistic on this front. The current situation that we're seeing in the telecom sector, I firmly believe, is something that will move towards consolidation by the first few months of the next year. And once the consolidation phase is more or less stable, then I think we will begin to see that fresh investments begin to happen.
All right. I think we are done with the questions here, but if there is any special point or key point that ma'am, either you or Joakim wants to make, putting India in the 5G space globally, please.
The only point that I would like to make is that we would need to work on multiple fronts. Sometimes what we have seen in industry is that we often wait for the government to take several steps. But I think as far as 5G is concerned, we all need to move in tandem. So whether it's on the standards, whether it's on the manufacturing of devices, whether it is on the use cases or actual usage, I think all components of the ecosystem need to start preparing for 5G. Otherwise, what we will see is a kind of lopsided development, and we will not be able to take as much advantage of 5G as we should be able to.
Yes.
Just very quickly, I'd like to second that, Madam Minister, very much, because 5G for mobile broadband, it will happen because the capacity need is there. But 5G for industries, that requires something more from all of us to make it happen. Because these industries, they don't know about cellular connectivity so much today. So we're a fairly unknown landscape for them. And we have noticed through our 38 MOUs with different telecom operators and 5G that when we start to engage with these industries, there is a huge interest, and they immediately see what kind of cost savings and what kind of efficiencies cellular connectivity in their production process can give. So we need to reach out as a telecom industry to these industries through initiatives like the IIT, through operators and vendors together engaging with industries to actually educate them, if you would like, about the benefits of cellular connectivity in their daily business. And I think that is extremely important.
Thank you very much.